Swing! Hello Dragonfly Swarm. Kinich is finally playable in Genshin Impact, and there have been a lot of opinions about his strength or his weaknesses or how easy or hard he is to play, but as the player base learns more and more about this complex and wildly unique DPS character, it becomes more and more apparent that he's quite a bit stronger than I, or many people I'd assume, initially thought. But there are several very important reasons as to why this is the case, so naturally in this video I will explain everything you need to know about why Kinich is quite a bit stronger than originally assumed in 5.0 Genshin Impact, including the more intricate mechanics of his kit, his in-game strength and versatility, his best teams, and finally some implications for his future that you might find quite interesting. But before I start, please consider subscribing, because every subscription is one punch to Aya's face. Kidding! I'm not kidding. Kinich is a character with a relatively high skill ceiling. That's not exactly a new choice for Hoyoverse. Many times in the past, they've released powerful characters who are simply difficult to play and require experience. But further than that, Kinich's kit is unlike any kit we've seen thus far in Genshin. He has arguably the most oddly unique playstyle in the entire Genshin roster. His entire thing is simply about grappling onto an enemy and then spinning around, hitting blind spots, and shooting at the enemy to charge his Night Soul meter as many times as he can, because every time it's fully charged, he can shoot a massive nuke called a Scale Spiker cannon at the enemy he's grappled onto. But a kit and a playstyle like Kinich's makes it generally quite difficult to calculate and do theoretical math or theory crafting on, because there are so many variables that involve your own skill as a player, which might dictate how valuable or useless he is in any given situation. For example, it's easy to look at someone like Raiden Shogun and calculate exactly how much damage she might deal during her burst in a hypercarry team, because once you've calculated the buffs she's receiving and how many hits she's landing, boom, you can get a good idea of how strong she'll be without ever having played her. But you can't exactly pinpoint that kind of strength on someone like Kinich, because much of his damage depends on your ability to fill his Night Soul meter in the 10 seconds you have access to it during his skill. This means that while you'll generally manage to launch around 3 Scale Spiker cannon shots on enemies, if you practice well and perfect his playstyle, you can hit upwards of 4 to 5 cannon shots, which significantly increases his total projected DPS. And while it is true that this takes a bit of getting used to in order to pilot him properly, he's nowhere near as difficult to play as I personally had initially assumed he might be, and let me explain. Some of the interesting mechanics you should note about Kinich are that his cannon shots are actually AoE, even though they specifically target the enemy you're grappled onto, meaning if multiple enemies are close enough together, his DPS is generally massively increased. But even further than that, every time you kill the enemy you're grappled onto, instead of the skill simply ending prematurely, you can actually normal attack again near an enemy to quickly grapple onto them and make them your next target for whatever remaining time you have left in Kinich's Night Soul state. But as if that wasn't already cool enough, whenever you finish off an enemy and grapple to a new one, if you don't already have a full Night Soul meter, the game will actually grant you a brand new blind spot to try and touch on that new enemy, meaning there are many instances where in AoE combat, you can spam Kinich's cannon shots far more efficiently and frequently than you'd typically be able to do. These 3 factors, alongside the more notable mechanics of his kit, make Kinich surprisingly very strong in AoE combat and oddly very easy to play. And what I mean by easy to play is in AoE combat, you can generally just spam your normal attack button and let Kinich slide around, deleting enemies, auto-grappling to new nearby enemies, and spam refreshing their blind spots, and your brain doesn't really even have to be on for that. It's an interaction that we most certainly could not have accounted for as theory crafters, because it involves so many incalculable variables that simply weren't available until he became playable. But all of this is to say, as strong as Kinich is at nuking solo combat, he is also immensely powerful and easy to play in AoE combat. But there are other odd mechanics too, for better and for worse. As an example, let me start by saying Kinich's grapple tether will stretch out and he'll have to slide further to hit blind spots depending on the size of the enemy he's tethered to. This basically means the larger your enemy, or rather the farther your tether is from them, the harder it is to maneuver and hit their blind spots, which will result in fewer overall Scale Spiker cannon shots, but it implies several other things too. If you're using close range abilities like Xiangling's Pyronado Burst, or even if you're in a Kuki Shinobu Hyperbloom team and trying to trigger seeds with her skill circle, it can actually be very awkward and difficult for Kinich to get in range to consistently hit the enemy or trigger the bloom seeds, because his tether forces him so far away from some large enemies. But with all of that said, there are also some good implications to this as well. Smaller enemies, even bosses, are far easier for Kinich to forward strafe on. Forward strafing is an admittedly random-ish mechanic, and I just named it right this second, but it's essentially an occurrence where Kniech can sometimes strafe right through an enemy rather than strafing in a wide circle, allowing him to tag blind spots far faster, but it only really occurs when he's tethered to smaller enemies. But it's also worth noting, in that same vein, with this mechanic in mind, especially on smaller enemies, if you cast Kniech's tether while you're right up next to the enemy, the tether's range will be so short that your first couple of slides will swing him almost in a full 360, so you'll pretty much guarantee a blind spot hit regardless of which direction you swing him in. So alongside having far greater advantage with abilities like Pyronado and Hyperbloom triggers, Kniech himself also has a much better time dishing his own damage on enemies that don't put too much distance between them and his tether. I should note that most bosses and enemies do not stretch his grapple tether too terribly far, thus there are only a small handful who genuinely put a problematic amount of distance between themselves and Kniech. This mechanic is more so worth keeping in mind so that you can understand when it's possible for Kniech to act faster and perform things like forward strafes for more total DPS potential, but it will be discussed a bit more in my team section so you know exactly which scenarios and teammates to look out for as problems for Kniech. All in all though, Kniech has a lot of intricate mechanics with his kit that make him oddly very strong in AoE combat, since he can forward strafe small enemies, chain his grapple to a new enemy every time he kills one, force reset blind spots with enemy kills, etc, etc. But in most teams, he's equally and often more so an excellent single target DPS with impressive nuke damage. It all depends on the ways in which you put his interesting kit to use and the specific teammate synergies that you consider when building a team around him. But there's also another interesting discussion I wanted to bring up, and that is Kniech's glaring problem right now, which is his best buffer and support, Bennett. Before you start rioting and grabbing my address for violent purposes, please hear me out. The major glaring issue that holds Kniech back right now is technically Bennett. And that's not to say that Bennett doesn't wildly buff his damage while also providing great healing and enabling burning, because he very much does. The problem is, Bennett's entire utility is confined to a circle, and Kniech, more than any other character in the game currently, absolutely sucks at standing still. This means that to even enjoy the massive buffs that Bennett can provide, you have to actively and very deliberately swing yourself into his burst circle every time you want to buff Kniech's cannon shot, and unfortunately a lot of the time that'll cost precious Night Soul duration and time that you cannot afford to lose. So often you'll have to expect at least 1 to 2 of your shots to miss Bennett's buffs. And unfortunately this issue is made even worse when you consider one of my previous points about how Kniech needs to slide further when he's tethered to very large enemies, so you're even less likely to find a good balance between hitting blind spots and staying in Bennett's burst. And the worst part is, there is no better support in the game for Kniech than Bennett in terms of consolidating 3 separate roles into one: buffing, healing, and pyro application. But the good thing about this, and the point that I wanted to pivot to with this part of the video, is that as strong as Kniech already is, which is actually quite strong, he has very obviously yet to reach his fullest potential. When more buffers become available that can properly replace Bennett's utility and role consolidation whilst not confining Kniech to a stationary circle, it'll become far easier to consistently buff every single aspect of his damage unconditionally, making his average DPS output even higher. And again, don't get me wrong at all, Bennett is an amazing support for Kniech and an amazing support in general, but Kniech becomes unnecessarily complicated sometimes when trying to play him effectively whilst also staying entirely in Bennett's burst circle. That is a gimmick that could very easily be remedied in the future, and if it is remedied, Kniech will be that much more powerful. Now then, after understanding all of these other mechanics we've talked about, the only other important thing to note with regard to Kniech's secretly massive potential is that he has access to several distinct team archetypes. Burning teams are quite noticeably his strongest and easiest teams to work with, but Burgeon teams are usually similarly powerful, and Kniech can even run surprisingly well as a driver for other Dendro-related teams, which I will briefly discuss. I say surprisingly because his kit doesn't at all inherently gear towards spread and hyperbloom teams, and yet he is surprisingly efficient as a driver for both such teams. But first, we gotta talk about his strongest teams and the ones that'll give him the highest personal damage output, burning and burgeon teams, focusing on burning first. Kniech works so well in burning teams because of his passives, which essentially state that every time the burning or burgeon reaction triggers near him, he'll gain some extra Night Soul points, meaning it becomes very easy to fill up his meter even in scenarios where you're against single target enemies or massive bosses that make it harder to hit blind spots. For this reason alone, it stands above most other team archetypes as his strongest in single target, and yet also functions very well in AoE too. Generally, your best iteration of this team is going to include something along the lines of Kniech, Emily, Bennett, and Xiangling. Reason being because Emily and Xiangling act as very strong sub-DPS units for Kniech, who, thanks to Bennett, is dealing his own ridiculous on-field damage. It's also a very easy team to manage because the rotation is as simple as dropping your Emily skill or burst, casting Bennett burst into his skill, quickly casting Xiangling's burst into her skill, and then swapping to Kinich for his on-field combo to finish the rotation off. Luckily though, even if you don't have Emily, there are many variations of Kenich's burning teams because all he technically needs is himself and a pyro unit. So you can run something like Kinich, Bennett, Fischl, and Thoma for similar results. You would just be sacrificing some DPS for more survivability and comfort, which in the current Spiral Abyss is much needed. But there are also very interesting variations like a double Geo burning team where you run something like Kinich, Bennett, Shiori, and Kachina for a significant boost to Kenich's personal damage thanks to Geo Resonance, whilst also getting a good amount of damage from Shiori and supportive utility from Bennett and Kachina. All in all though, Kenich's burning teams have no shortage of variations, so even if you don't have Emily for his premium team, other options perform similarly with more or less comfort and survivability between characters. The other major variation of teams, however, is Kinich Burgeon teams, where you'll need to have Kinich, a Pyro unit, and a Hydro unit on your team, with your final teammate usually being a second Pyro unit with slow Pyro application who can act as the Burgeon DPS. But you'll find that sometimes the Kinich Burgeon teams aren't even really all that big on Burgeon damage. There's just some really good Hydro buffers in the game, and we'll get into that right now because the most powerful variation of this team is generally, unsurprisingly, Kinich, Bennett, Xiangling, and Furina. It's funny to note too that this team variation can actually end up performing even stronger than the Emily burning variant, but that'll depend on lots of variables such as how many Burgeons you're able to proc, how much fanfare you can accumulate, etc, etc. Generally though, even if you don't have Furina or cannot put her in this team, other Hydro units can substitute her quite comfortably, for example Xingqiu or Yelan. And with either Xingqiu or Yelan as your Hydro unit and someone like Thoma or Dea as your Burgeon trigger, you can expect your rotations to look something like this. Yelan or Xingqiu skill into their burst, swap to Bennett for his skill and his burst, then swap to Dea for a double skill cast, and finally back to Kinich for his on-field combos. With Thoma, the rotation will be very similar, only cast Thoma's burst and then his skill before you do the other parts of the rotation. Do note that Burgeon teams will not typically perform as well as burning teams in single target, and it's actually generally kind of difficult to even consistently trigger Burgeons in single target scenarios with Kenich's teams. They will, however, absolutely decimate in AoE combat. But there are other teams to consider as well. Surprisingly, spread teams and Hyperbloom teams are still great to slot Kinich into. Generally, Hyperbloom teams are just always strong as long as you have your core units together, so Kinich is really just a cherry on top to this team, but he will help apply a lot more on-field Dendro for more spread damage and more blooms, plus his own personal DPS will add a considerable chunk to this already insane team archetype. And there are plenty of variations you can make to your Kenich's Hyperbloom teams, so the characters suggested on the screen are simply general ideas for what characters you can comfortably work with when building it. I would argue your strongest Hyperbloom variants for Kinich generally involve Nahida, Yelan, and Kuki Shinobu, since these three will provide everything you need for a strong Hyperbloom interaction while also providing some healing and buffing for Kenich's damage, and that's always nice. But other variations will work similarly as powerful. Finally, for spread and aggravate teams, you'll find that generally Hyperbloom is always superior for Kinich since it provides almost everything he can do in a spread team with just more reaction damage, but it can be done, and there are several variations you can work with. Both of these team variants work fine in single target and in AoE, but Hyperbloom is generally the more standout archetype to aim for if you're gonna deviate from Kenich's staple burning Burgeon niche. All in all, Kinich is a strong character. In fact, he's quite a bit stronger than I had originally assumed he would be, and his many intricate mechanics and interactions with enemies make him very fun to dig into as a high experience, high reward kind of character, but even at a baseline, he can be very easy to play in many of his available teams, and can interchangeably work very well both in single target and in AoE combat. I don't usually like ranking characters by strength since everyone's opinions, investment, and perspectives are different, but I would comfortably argue that Kinich stands quite far above the average DPS, though I wouldn't say he's among the very strongest in the game. He's genuinely a very strong character though, and once you get the hang of his kit and some of his odd or obscure mechanics, you can churn out a lot of damage from him. Be sure you're paying attention to the mechanics I went over when playing him in whatever team you decide on, and you'll find that Kinich is a reliable, respectable addition to the DPS roster in 5.0 Genshin Impact. But that's about all I had to rant about for this video. If any of it helps you, please like and subscribe, and also join my Discord server because there's a lot of cool people in there and we would love to meet you. Anyway, I'm gonna swing around like Spider-Man in Natlan while mourning my Kazuha who was completely power crept for world exploration. See you in the next video.